Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and I'm very happy to be here, and I owe this invitation to my friend Anki Slenko, who is a professor here, and to all the students who have invited me. Thank you very much for this invitation. I would just tell you, one of my friends here present, that this is a very sensitive topic, and it's always very difficult to talk about a revolution which is still there, some more or less, somehow, or the people who have done it, some of them are still there, and especially the wounds of the Iranian Revolution are there, and some of you have the wounds. I can feel it on your bodies or in your minds. Anyway, I will try to not to go through the events, because I'm not here to talk about the events with you, but try to make an analysis, and I want to share my analysis of the Iranian Revolution, how we can talk about it 40 years later, and eventually in the Q&A, I suppose we can have a good conversation. Now, just let me start with Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who prophesied with remarkable accuracy that the 20th century would be marked by great wars fought in the name of philosophical ideas. But what Nietzsche could not have anticipated was that at the ending years of the 20th century, there would be a revolution in the name of God and in the name of Islam, establishing a Shiite theocracy. Well, the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 was clearly one of the major events of the 20th century and a momentous development in the modern history of Islam. It certainly was a catalyst to what we have today in the 21st century, with all these different Islamist groups around the globe, and I would say new revival of Islam, political Islam especially, not mystical Islam or cultural Islam. So undoubtedly, the Iranian Revolution opened a new chapter for political Islam in 20th and 21st century, and it had a huge impact on all movements across the globe, especially those that were using Islamic frames of reference for political activism. Now let me turn to a person whom I knew well, not quite well, but well, and I attended his classes at the Collège de France. I want to talk about Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault actually, he was very enthusiastic, as you know, about the Iranian Revolution, and he declared the Iranian Revolution, I quote him, as the spirit of a world without spirit. This is a very famous quote by Michel Foucault about the Iranian Revolution. And he actually asked the question, one bears on Iran and its peculiar destiny. At the dawn of history, Persia invented the state and conferred its models on Islam. Its administrators staffed the caliphate, but from this same Islam, it derived a religion that gave to its people infinite resources to resist state power. In this will for an Islamic government, he's talking about the will of the people, the Iranian people, for an Islamic government in 1978-79, he's asking, should one see a reconciliation, a contradiction, or the threshold of something new? Question mark. This is the question which was asked, as you know, in Corriere della Sera, the articles which were written by Michel Foucault in 1978 when he came to Tehran, and he met with many Iranian intellectuals at the time. Now, following Foucault, we can say that from the very beginning, the Iranian Revolution remained a significant social and political transformation full of paradoxes and unpredictable twists. The Iranian Revolution was surprising, certainly surprising for all of us, not because it caused a monarch to collapse, the Shah of Iran, but because of the way in which people organized themselves and participated in massive demonstrations the likes of which had probably never been seen since the French Revolution of 1789, or maybe the Revolution of 1917 in Russia. However, I believe that the Iranian Revolution, like many other revolutions, united several groups, several classes, several parties, who, despite their different ideologies and backgrounds, were all against the old regime, the Shah's regime. Also in the Iranian Revolution, as in the French Revolution and later Russian Revolution, you have the coalition which did not last very long, and the Iranian clerics ended having a leading role. And that's also one of the mysteries. How is it that, and this is a question I'm putting to you, I cannot answer it. Why a revolution which is a popular revolution at the end of the day chooses clerics as its leaders and establishes an Islamic government instead of having a secular government, or let's say a secular republic. But the interesting point is that most non-clerics who were in the opposition against the Shah of Iran underestimated the probability of clerical rule, despite the presence of the clergy in all the major political events in Iran since the Constitutional Revolution of 1906. I mean, nobody asked the question, really, nobody. I was just telling one of my friends here present that I was a student in Paris, so I lived the Iranian Revolution in Paris at Neuf-le-Château, where Khomeini was and his group were actually living for 2 months. And it was interesting that many times, I mean, the question didn't come up of why we have an Islamic leader, why the clergy are actually the leaders leading the Iranian Revolution, and many the paradoxes nobody wanted to talk about. So as we can see, what we call, quote unquote, the religious dimension of the Iranian Revolution, if it has a religious dimension, through its dependence on Islam, was well established in the decades leading up to the uprisings of 1978. Because, as I said, the clerics were always there since 1906, if not before that. Again, with the tobacco revolt, for example, as we have the case of Mirza Shirazi. So we can refer here to the notion popularized in the 1970s by people like Shariati and many others. Sorry for the name dropping for those of you who don't know much about the Iranian history. Who talked about return to the self, or return to cultural roots, by resisting the hegemonic influence of the West, which actually was a replica of Frantz Fanon's discourse of return of the oppressed, but with a peculiar Iranian twist. Moreover, for too many observers inside and outside Iran, events leading up to the revolution of 1979 took a mystifying and seemingly irrational course. Usually those who try to explain, my point is, well, usually those who try to explain hastily and emotionally the causes of the Iranian Revolution and the Shah's collapse generally only tend to focus on one or another specific issue, such as the corruption of the Pahlavi regime, the undemocratic ways of Shah's rule, the effect of Savak's, the secret police, Shah's secret police repression, or the economic gap between the rich and the poor. This is what you see in most of the interpretations and analyses that is done on the Iranian Revolution. All these causes existed in many other Islamic countries. Now, I'm putting you into question. Let's take, for example, Morocco with Hassan II. You had exactly the same thing. You had repression, you had political prisoners, you had the gap between the poor and the rich. But Hassan II was never forced to go to exile like the Shah of Iran. He died in his bed. So why did it happen? And it's an Islamic country, and there were Islamic forces. But why did we had a revolution in Iran and not in Morocco? It didn't never happen. Well, if we consider the Iranian Revolution not only as a political event, but also as a psychological watershed, exactly as it was the case with the rise of Hitler to power in 1933 in Germany, we can understand why many Iranians believed back in 1978 that there was a messianic nature to Khomeini's leadership, because that was the case. We have to accept that we did that. Many Iranians had this actually attitude, psychological attitude. I do not want to exaggerate, of course, the importance of religious hysteria in the Iranian Revolution, but this is certainly the factor which was pervasive and prevalent among sections of traditional classes in Iran. But in truth, Khomeini's success in the Iranian Revolution had certainly nothing to do with the divine providence. But given that the Iranian population believed for centuries in the divine rights of the kings, it should have come as little surprise that the people were receptive to such ideas rather than having an acute sense of political pragmatism. So we were not at the time of Scottish Enlightenment or French Enlightenment in Iran at the time. So we were not expecting to have a Voltaire or Rousseau or Montesquieu. So it's pretty understandable that ordinary people actually thought of Khomeini as a leader, as a religious leader. I think Khomeini's leadership, followed by the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran, can better be understood in patrimonial terms, assisted by periodic doses of charisma. Though the first draft of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic tended to support the Republican view, and that's why, because they started the draft with Mr. Habibi and a few others who have done the intellectual exercise in Paris or in France, and they were very much influenced by the French Fifth Republic with the elected president and prime minister. But as you know, by the end of 1979, it was becoming increasingly apparent that a more rigorous interpretation of Islam by Khomeini and other ayatollahs was becoming the text of the law. The immediate consequence of this development was to institutionalize Khomeini's role as the leader of the revolution. There is no doubt that Khomeini had close links with the Society of Islam Devotees created by Nawab Safavi, the Fadain Islam, as we call them also, in the early 1940s, which played a major role in connecting Shiite fundamentalism to Islamic fundamentalist movements in other countries. So there is also another idea that which I think historians have to write again more about it, is the link which goes from Ayatollah Khomeini to Nawab Safavi, the Fadain Islam, who actually assassinated two prime ministers, for those of you who don't know the Iranian history, and who had a link with Al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, the famous Muslim Brotherhood. So there was a link between the Shiite fundamentalism and Sunni fundamentalism, and they were quite impressed by that. So Khomeini, therefore, was not only popular among common Iranians for his uncompromising attitude against the Shah and his anti-imperialist and populist rhetoric since 1963, but also because he and his followers were fully ready and organized for the establishment of an Islamic regime in Iran. All the other political parties, and this is also one of the interpretations, I hope that most of you agree with me, this was the only, I would say, political line of thought, which had a very solid platform, and they knew what they wanted. The other political parties, actually, the Marxist ones, the non-Marxist ones, the liberal ones, Islamic liberal ones, they practically didn't have a very, very strong platform, and they didn't know where they were taking Iran. So, defying all the myths of secular modernization and shattering all the political ideologies of modernity, the Islamic Republic became the first theocratic state in the modern world to have institutionalized the Shiite idea of Velayat Faqih, or the rule of the jurist. However, as I said, the institutionalization of Khomeini's role as the Faqih, who possessed the necessary charismatic authority and political astuteness to rule Iran, did not manage the implicit tensions which existed and continue to exist between tradition and modernity and the Republican and the authoritarian in the Iranian society. As a result, and this is my idea, actually, I share it with some others, as a result, from the very beginning, from the early days of the revolution, there was actually a tension between two forms of sovereignty in Iran. Divine sovereignty and popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty coming because there was a revolution, there was a good people behind it, and divine sovereignty because actually you had the figure of Khomeini himself, but also because of the Shiite theocracy. So the concept of popular sovereignty, which I think is very, very important, which is derived from the indivisible will of the Iranian nation, and you find it in Article 6 of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, is what is referred to practically in the past 40 years in the elections, presidential elections. Before that, you had the election of the prime minister, the parliamentary election. So the idea of election per se, which is a Republican idea, became important. It didn't need to be important because we're talking about a Shiite theocracy. Why shouldn't in a theocracy you have election of a president, which is supposed to be important? And as for the divine concept of sovereignty, which is derived from God's will through the medium of Shiite institutions and the imamate, is bestowed on the existing faqih as the rightful ruler of Shiite community. So here again, I go back to what Foucault talked about. Foucault actually referred to the introduction of a spiritual dimension into political life in Iran. Spiritual dimension getting into political life. I don't think that was the case. The case was that we actually arrived at political theology, what we call a political theology, not at all spirituality into politics. And that's why actually the first decade of the Iranian Revolution was marked by theological governance of Ayatollah Khomeini himself and the ever-growing power of his followers, violent elimination of the opposition groups, and the enforcement of ideological controls on the Iranian population. And it was the end of practically all the political parties. It was the end of all the autonomist or separatist ethnic groups in Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, in the south of Iran, practically everywhere. Now, the success of the Islamists against all these different social and political groups, again, this is a question to ask. Why? How did they arrive at destroying practically everyone in the Iranian society? First, I think it has several factors. One, the Islamists, I think, enjoyed far wider support among the masses. That we have to admit. It's not actually the Fedayeen or the MKO or the Bazargan's group or people who were following Mossadegh or others who had really were backed or had the support of the masses. Secondly, I think that the war with Saddam Hussein was actually a benediction for the Ayatollah Khomeini and those who in power. Because in the name of 8 years war, there were measures of exception. Putting people in prison, killing people, destroying political parties, and even economic measures. So the war actually helped the consolidation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And last but not least, the Islamization at home was a way for the regime to attract the support of the bazaar and traditional socio-economic groups, which actually helped the Islamists to come to power. We have to admit that two revolutions, or maybe we can say two revolutions and a revolt in 20th century Iran were backed by the bazaar, by the money of the bazaar. Without that financial help, the Iranian Revolution could not have happened. That's what we know for sure. But the Iranian regime actually suffered from its own revolutionary and populist narrative, next to its paternalistic and charismatic narrative, especially after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, which created, as I said, many paradoxes inside the Iranian regime itself. though the forceful post-revolutionary imposition of Islamic values and ways of living can be considered to be the most distinctive aspect of Iranian Revolution of 1979, insertion of cultural politics into everyday lives of Iranians in the name of Islamic purity and other principles, I think it created a reverse attitude and a sentiment of confrontation with the Islamic regime, which is still continuing until today, pushing the Iranian society to become Islamicized, actually, which is still the case, created a lot of movement. So here, the popular sovereignty that I was talking about, which I call it the Republican feature or gesture of Iranian society, has always been there. It has been there with the women's rights movement, especially. It has been there with the Iranian student movement. It has been there with the youth movement. And it has been there with the work of dissident intellectuals and artists from the very, very beginning. Also, the presence of these two conflicting conceptions of sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy have always been a bone of contention in Iranian politics itself, often defining the ideological contours of the political power struggle among contending forces. That's where we talk about the moderates and the conservatives in Iranian politics, as you have heard it many times. It comes because of that, I believe. I think one of the other factors that we cannot, if we are talking about 40 years later after the revolution happened, is the demographic factor. Actually, the demographic factor is sitting in this room right now, meaning 60% of the country's population, which is under the age of 30 or 35, which is a huge change in Iran's actually demography population, but also in this mindset and of Iranians actually, a huge change in the Iranian society. So I think that what has happened is that for these youngsters, 6 to 7 million of them educated are outside Iran today. In the past 20 years, what has been important for them has not been like in the beginning of the revolution, the political theology or ideologies, but it's the lack of jobs, is actually social freedom and everyday opportunities, which has been the principal problems of life in Iran. So one of the main reasons for this is that soon after the victory of the Islamists in the revolution of 1979, most of the modernizing efforts and institutions of the Pahlavi, the first Pahlavi and the second Pahlavi, were entirely abandoned and completely reversed. Some of the most visible, I think we should mention it, and I will mention it here, some of the most visible of these institutions, of course, which were completely reversed, which were the good points actually of the Pahlavi regime. Restriction of polygamy, which was reversed. The family protection law against arbitrary divorce, which was reversed by the Islamic regime. Women actually were thrown out of their jobs in many aspects as judges and others. And of course, last but not least, the wearing of the hijab, which was the worst. So one point that Iranian feminists talk about, but Iranian men practically never talk about it, is that the very first movement against the Islamic regime came in March 1979 from women. And this is something very, very important because we can say this is the first move of the Iranian civil society against the Islamic regime and the Islamization of Iran. Why don't we talk about it? And it was against the hijab, but it was more than against the hijab. It was against the mindset which the revolution was bringing with itself, or let's say the Islamization of Iran was bringing. And of course, women actually trying to demonstrate and fight against it. And this sense of empowerment, I think, and agency that has been present in the Iranian civil society, we started with Iranian women, I insist to talk about it, and then we have it with urban Iranian youth, has found itself face to face with two generations of underdog Iranians who, because of the fact that they were underdogs and they were coming from poorer classes, they have a taste of power and wealth, which now turned out to become very criminalized or criminal in today's Iran. And they created two institutions that, again, we need to talk about, the Basij and the Revolutionary Guards. Two typical criminal revolutions, institutions, of the Islamic regime, the Basij and the Revolutionary Guards. In the past 40 years, in accordance with the Shiite clergy, these two institutions had a monopoly of violence, in addition to total control over many sectors of Iranian economy and politics, and sometimes over Iranian media. Now, let me start to anatomize, actually, or make an anatomy of the first institution, the Iranian Shiite clergy, who were historically independent from government. You know, it's very interesting because not all Shiite clergy, they believed in Islamic regime. Actually, Khomeini's gurus, those professors with whom he studied, they didn't believe in that. Somebody like Hairi, for example, didn't believe in that. And today you have Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq who doesn't believe in an Islamic regime. So it's not because you're a Shiite clergy that you necessarily believe in Islamization or Islamic politics. So what happened was that with the Iranian Revolution, there was a control of the temporal and the spiritual at the same time by the Iranian clergy. And of course, the clerical establishment effectively became the central, I would say, ideological apparatus of the state. And they fought, and it's interesting that they even fought religious or Shiite intellectualism and Sufism. So what was important for them, and I underline it again, was political theology or theologization of politics, and not necessarily intellectualization of Shiism or, let's say, mystical Islam. They were against mystical Islam all the time, and it was very, very important for them. And this institutionalization of this new power and consolidation of new political and economic elites, which took place, actually, it took place also economically because they through etatization of Iranian economy, through expansion of state institutions, through militarization of power with the monopolization of violence, as I said, with Basij and the Revolutionary Guards. And of course, this is where I think that the role of the Revolutionary Guards becomes very, very important. Because if there is only one institution today in Iran which has full power, are the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Economically, politically, they control the Iranian foreign policy, they control the Iranian economy. They are actually, and we can say up to very large, in a large manner and percentage, they also control the Iranian politics. So the military capabilities of Islamic Revolutionary Guards is something which helps Iran to become a hegemonic power and have a hegemonic role in the Middle East. I think that if we want to explain, actually this is what I do, maybe some of you disagree with me, if you want to explain the Iranian foreign policy in the past 40 years, I think the role which has been done by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards is the most important, because they have a military capability of 100,000 Air Force and Navy branches, 20,000 men, intelligence services, they have their own prisons, and they function independently from Iranian government. So it's very, very important to understand how they can govern Iran and, of course, how they engage in missions abroad, and they support movements like the Palestinian movements, or the Hezbollah in Lebanon. So let us not forget that as the Islamic Republic Iran found itself more and more mixed up with Assad and pro-Assad in Syria and with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps actually became more and more important, and they had their own proxies around the region. So Iranian foreign policy, which is a direct, I think, link with what I was talking about, meaning the way the revolution came and established a government, has actually also has had its own contradictions. It has a nationalist side, but at the same time, it's a very Islamist foreign policy. On the other hand, for a long time, the central figure of the Iranian foreign policy has been the supreme leader. It was Khomeini for a long time. Khomeini now today, who combines actually political and religious authority, and so it also complicates very much this ideology which is behind the Iranian foreign policy. Now, 40 years after the revolution, Iranian establishment still believes in its universalist role, and as an instrument of its foreign policy provides arms, training, military advisors in support of allied governments as well as armed factions. However, Iran's foreign policy is not limited to militarily supporting allied governments and armed factions. It also sometimes funds political candidates in the neighboring countries, and sometimes it has its own contradictions. Now, these contradictions all have been in Iranian politics. I'll give you an example. In the Karabakh conflict between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, Iranians actually took the side of Armenians, which, I mean, should not be the case if we say that their ideology is actually the Shiite ideology. But they did that because they do that from time to time, because sometimes their foreign policy is not necessarily theologically or ideologically driven, but it's because of their interests. So it has become more and more pragmatist, because in the beginning of the revolution, as for those of you who have followed it, the slogans, the mottos of Iranian foreign policy was neither east nor west, but the Islamic Republic or export of the revolution in order to free Muslim countries. Or non-Muslim countries, actually. But today, it's no more the slogan, and they have taken their distance from it. So the nationalistic tools also have become much more important, especially in the policy making of Iran. Now, another point which I think is important to talk about is that, as I said in the beginning, and this is very important when we're talking about Iran 40 years after the revolution, if Iranian revolution had not happened, we would not have had ISIS, Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda. Islamic State, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda are two forces which exist because of the dramatic changes which were done which were brought actually in the region because of the Iranian revolution. With Gaddafi and Saddam by themselves, this would not have happened. Saddam Hussein became what he became, and he was later destroyed because of the Iranian revolution. And the Islamic, I would say, the whole Islamic world, the changes which appeared, terrorism, but also this will to power of people like Gaddafi and others, is because of the Iranian revolution. Because they were so scared, but at the same time, they felt that they had to show their own power, that they started financing, terrorist groups and making a lot of mishmash and problems in the region. So the Iranian foreign policy making and geostrategic gesture in the past 40 years correspond actually to different phases. And these different phases, I'm sure that most of you know these phases. These phases have all been different from each other. I mean, the first phase, as I said, more ideological and more based on the character of Khomeini himself, the charismatic level figure of Khomeini. The second phase, which is the time of Rafsanjani, becomes more pragmatic. Then you have the phase of Mr. Khatami, and the fourth phase is the phase of Ahmadinejad, which becomes more populist. I'm not going to get into that because I want to get more quickly to the Q&A. And the fifth one is actually what we're living right now, which was the most important event in it was the nuclear agreement with the P5+1. Now, my point again is, and you might laugh when you hear that, is that when we're talking about division of power in Iranian society, and many talk about that, and factionalism in Iranian politics, which is also one of the characteristics of the Iranian revolution, all the time, on the side of conservatives or the reformists, you have Don Corleones, like in The Godfather, like in Mario Puzo's Godfather. Why? Because as the quote in The Godfather, it says, behind every successful fortune there's a crime. And on all the sides you have criminals and you have crime, either the reformists or the non-reformists. Now, this is a very important factor because crime was once something that set some Iranian criminals off from the rest of the Iranian society. But now it is just another route to power in Iran and for the prosperity of people in Iranian society. So you have many criminals around, actually. And I would say Iranian politics 40 years after the Iranian Revolution has become criminalized. Iranian economy has become criminalized. Iranian foreign policy has become criminalized. And these are actually also, it has to do with what we have 40 years after the Iranian Revolution. So if we take this line of thought, I think that there is no doubt in my mind that in the past 40 years there has been an effort from Iranian government and Iranian politicians and revolutionary guards and those who have the monopoly of violence to consolidate a hegemonic nature in the region, meaning in the Middle East. If people talk about it, they are right. Iranian Islamic regime always wanted to have a hegemonic power be a hegemonic power. Now, since I am getting to the end of my talk, now the billion-dollar question would be, will there be a new revolution in Iran ending with the restoration of the monarchy, or will it be the takeover by the revolutionary guards in Iran, which would end up with a wide-scale confrontation between Israel and Iran? They are both, I think, very valid questions. Are we going to have a restoration, like sometime in France, after the French Revolution, or are we going to have the revolutionary guards making a coup d'etat, and therefore Iranian society is going to be more militarized, and of course we're going to have a complete confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel? Again, $1 billion question. I think it's difficult to have a definite answer to these questions, but what I can say is that after 40 years of existence, the Islamic regime in Iran is still a revolutionary regime. It wants to be a revolutionary regime, which is in a position of stagnation, it's in a position of confusion, it's in a position of chaos. And of course, we have to turn again towards the Iranian civil society and look and say, well, are there any elements in the Iranian civil society which can bring changes in Iran? Well, unlike what happened exactly 10 years ago, the Green Movement of 2009, which was largely a product of the urban middle class youth in Tehran, and the unrest, the turmoils that we had last year, and we have it, still have it, more or less, these years, which reflect the economic grievances and there's a lot of problems that the working class has. It's no more about just intellectuals and artists, it's about the working classes. It has alienated, actually, institutional politics. It has alienated the Iranian, I would say, social classes from Iranian politics more and more. And as a result, these protests have been largely driven by disaffected young people in rural areas, in towns, in small towns, in big towns, who seize the pretext to express their frustrations with economic woes and that are caused by Iran's foreign policy, because one of the demands, as you know, is that you get quickly out of Yemen, you get quickly out of Syria, and you spend the money for us. So this also is one of the aspects that we need to talk about. Of course, the main aspect is also, as I said, for those Iranian Canadians who are in this room, they are sitting here, is a generational gap. Generational gap are always very important factors in revolutions. It played a very important role in French Revolution. It played a very important role in the Russian Revolution. People of the young Russians at the time of Gorbachev had nothing to do with the Russians at the time of Stalin or Lenin. You know, their mindset had completely changed. It's the same in Iran. We have had a political and societal evolution, huge evolution in the past, at least in the past 20, 25 years in Iran. And I think that this explosive mix of growing population, which led a youth vote, and combined with urbanization, because before the revolution happened, actually 70% of Iran was rural. Today, 85% of Iran is urbanized. Increasing unemployment, but expansion of university education is huge. You know, you have a lot of young people who are educated and professional. So we have a huge middle class who is demanding change, and this change will certainly come at some point or another. In other words, I believe that Iran today is very much like Soviet Union in its last days. Disenchantment with ideology, as you had it also in Russia at the time. There is no belief in Islamic regime among the Iranian youth, not at all. Reform movement has failed to fulfill the popular demand, and you have spontaneous movements, spontaneous writings, and uncivil unrest, as we can see it in the many, at least in the past 2 years, but even more, I would say. So, to end, I will go back again and ask the question, if the participants in the Iranian Revolution wanted more than anything to be seen and to be heard, why then did the revolution degenerate in such violence and tyranny, which still plagues Iran to this day? And I think that my analysis is to turn towards French Revolution again, maybe because I studied in France and lived 20 years in that country. But French Revolution, I think, seems a good point of reference to answer this question. Indeed, the common notion of revolutions turning in upon themselves and becoming antithetical to their original principles, from freedom to repression, from fraternity to terror, finds perhaps its fullest expression in Reign de Terror, the reign of terror of Robespierre and Saint-Just. Now, Robespierre actually infamously defended the necessity of terror in his book, which is called On the Principles of Revolutionary Government, and he said revolutionary government needs extraordinary activity precisely because it is at war. Iranian politicians said exactly the same thing. We are supposed to dismantle all the political groups because we are in war with Saddam Hussein. We are supposed to put people in prison. We are supposed to eliminate 50,000, 70,000, 80,000 prisoners who were in prison because we are in war, or we are at the end of the war, or we have to reconstruct this country. So it's actually what Robespierre said. Revolutionary government owes good citizens full national protection. To enemies of the people, it owes nothing but death. And this was the motto, I think, of the Iranian Revolution also. So from my point of view, what we can say after 40 years is that the Iranian Revolution was doomed insofar as the actors involved choose to pursue a flawed revolutionary model and adhere to ideological rather than deliberative methods. People came out and said, we want freedom, but there was no deliberation after that. And they said, okay, if you want freedom, why do you choose clergy to become your bosses or to head your governments? So more precisely, if I take the analysis of somebody like Hannah Arendt, I would say that the foundation for freedom was destroyed when the constitution was taken out of the hands of the Iranian people and appropriated by the Shiite clergy, imposing its Islamic laws upon them. And today, if a change has to come in Iran, the space of appearance in Iran's civil society must be recreated through action if there is to be any hope of a further move towards democratization. But in a country where strong authoritarian governments have predominated for a century, the eruption of the idea of civil society in the public debate does not automatically lead to its empowerment. It's not because we talk about civil society that the Iranian civil society can empower itself. And for the time being, Iranian civil society does not have the power to press the state through its representatives, which are the youth, women, Iranian feminists, intellectuals, artists, workers. And maybe it is because of this absence that Iranian politics is tearing itself into pieces by a political gridlock symbolized by the unpopularity of the Iranian clergy, the decapitation of the reform movement, the growing dissatisfaction of the Iranians inside and outside the country, and a legitimacy crisis, which is the most important, of the Islamic regime in general. So, consequently, I think that in the long run, change will come from inside the country, where the tradition of autocracy would and should be criticized and replaced by modern and liberal mechanisms of political life. And I think that the young Iranians will certainly change Iran at some point. I hope for the best. Now, on this note of hopeful pessimism, I would call it, let me finish with a saying by Sir Winston Churchill, who said that dictators ride upon tigers which they dare not dismount, and the tigers are getting hungry. Well, the least we can say about the tiger of the Iranian Revolution is that it is very hungry, and Iranian autocrats dare not dismount. Thank you very much.